The beautiful boy changed into extravagant clothing and even wore flashy earrings. He had enough confidence to stand out among the crowd. The muddy road was lined with men of various ages, all gathered there in hopes of winning the king's favor. The old man next to him mocked these men as nothing more than peacocks displaying their feathers. George, disgusted by the term, retorted that he was here on business. The old man continued, saying that he and the king were of similar age, and that the king's health wasn't necessarily better than his. George retorted, stating that the king was the king, and he was just an old countryman. Before long, the royal carriage approached slowly. The men eagerly postured and preened, desperate to catch the king's eye. George, of course, was no exception. He pushed through the crowd, trying to showcase his uniqueness. However, he was shoved by the throng and fell into the muddy road. The old man nearby, seeing this, laughed so hard he nearly lost his teeth. And the carriage approaching from behind nearly cost George his life. The failure was absolute. Humiliated, George, his pride shattered. George hanged himself from the tree he often used, but his mother saved him once again. It was well known that the king had a fondness for handsome men, and with her son's naturally striking features, Mary encouraged George to become the king's companion. A single failure did not mean a lifetime of defeat. Mary wouldn't give up after one setback. She was well acquainted with the madam of a brothel, so she took George there to meet the king's courtiers in secret. The courtier revealed that the king had been deeply impressed by George. However, his chief male favorite, Samo, kept a strict watch, making it nearly impossible for outsiders to approach the king. Samo, emboldened by the king's affection, behaved arrogantly within the palace, to the point of disregarding the queen entirely. Naturally, this made him a thorn in the queen's side. With the help of a courtier, Mary was able to meet the queen in private. The queen had only one request: for Samo to fall out of favor. As for who the king's next lover would be, she didn't care. Mary assured the queen that her son would obey her every command. With the queen's support, George gained effortless access to the palace. He made a stunning entrance at a royal banquet. Thanks to his training in dance during his time in France, he performed with ease, capturing everyone's attention. His elegance, charm, and delicate beauty were utterly captivating. The king's gaze was firmly fixed on George, unable to look away for even a moment. For the first time, Samo felt a genuine sense of threat. The queen used the pretext of the crown prince's ill health to prompt the king to visit him. This excuse was the only way to circumvent Samo's surveillance. George, who had been hiding in the shadows, was brought out. The queen plainly stated that it was time for a new lover to enter the king's bedchamber. The king, already interested in George, granted him a noble title, for only those with titles could serve the king in this manner. Now that George had received his benefits, it was only fair that the king would want something in return. All George needed was one opportunity to serve the king closely, and he could offer the king whatever he desired. It was inevitable that Samo would discover George's actions, but George knew how to capture hearts. He remained composed, neither crying nor causing a scene, and subtly positioned himself at the door's edge, playing the role of the delicate, helpless beauty to perfection. Despite this, Samo still couldn't stop him. George clung to the king like a stubborn adhesive, impossible to shake off. As a result, Samo warned George to be more cautious while hunting. At the meal, all the king's male lovers sat together. Samo barely ate, taking only a small portion. George, with a playful tone, remarked that he was still young and could eat much more. It was only older people who lost their appetite. George's comment made the king laugh, but it was undoubtedly a subtle jab at Samo. Fortunately, the king intervened, telling Samo that he was being too serious. It was clear that, by now, George had begun to hold some weight in the king's heart. Before the hunt, George walked alongside the king. Seizing the opportunity, he showed off his French. To his surprise, the king seemed quite interested in the language, which brought them closer. Meanwhile, Samo, walking ahead, cast a jealous glance at them. The king, noticing this, told George to be cautious in the woods, as a handsome young man had previously fallen off his horse and died there. Soon, they spotted the game in the forest. Samo and George were at the front, racing ahead. During the ride, Samo attempted to push George off his horse, but George, skilled as he was, managed to avoid falling. Just as the king was about to catch up, George deliberately threw himself from the horse. Samo, fearing he would be blamed, quickly distanced himself. After falling, George felt his injuries weren't too severe, so he got up and hurried toward a nearby tree, deliberately crashing into it to knock himself unconscious. When he finally regained consciousness, the king was there. This gave George the opportunity to ride on the same horse as the king. The king asked if Samo had pushed him, but George said that he had fallen by accident. The king didn't say much, but in his heart, he understood that George was protecting Samo to avoid embarrassing him. As they caught up with the main group, Samo quickly began to defend himself. The king responded, saying that George had never said Samo had pushed him. Inside the tent, the royal physician carefully tended to George's wounds. The physician remarked that the medicine was extremely precious, but the king had insisted that no expense be spared for George's care. Late that night, George suddenly heard soft footsteps outside. It was the king, who had entered the tent. At that moment, George, like a wounded fawn, evoked sympathy. The two locked eyes in a silent exchange, and from there, the rest of the story spoke for itself. With her son now secured a position by the king's side, Mary decided to take a brief respite for herself. Under the cover of night, she visited the madam's residence. The details from there need not be elaborated further. The muddy road was still lined with people, but now George was seated in the royal carriage. The old man who had once mocked him now bowed in respect. George's heart swelled with a deep sense of satisfaction. However, this game of power was just beginning.